Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Lisa Selin Davis, a journalist and author of a new book, Housewife, Why Women Still Do It All and What to Do Instead. We spoke about the social history of the American suburbs, the ennui, the anxiety that Betty Friedan so famously described in The Feminine Mystique, and whether it's still plagues the same class of American women today. What is lost to civil society when women working full-time is the norm. And in the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about the so-called two-income trap and some of the economic consequences of the mass influx of middle-class women into the labour market. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where as ever you can find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Lisa, should we start by talking about terminology? Because you've called the book Housewife, but you do also discuss the fact that it is a contested term and there has been an evolution of the term. And I always think that when you are in the presence of a euphemism treadmill, right, when you are seeing constantly updated language because archaic language is now deemed offensive in some way, you're normally also in the presence of something that is low status. It's normally a good indication that people think there's something bad about the category you're trying to describe, and that's why they keep updating the language. And I think that probably applies to the housewife, the homemaker, the stay-at-home mom, etc., etc. So talk to me a bit about that language evolution over time.
I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about there's so much that's verboten now that it makes me wonder about that. I wrote an op-ed a few years ago about the word guys, just arguing that it was fine and that it was, it comes from Guy Fawkes, and it's, who cares what it was originally for? We all know what it means, kind of thing. And of course, I got some emails that I would be harming trans and non-binary people simply by suggesting that it was okay to use the word guides. But I feel I wonder if in this time when so much about language is contested, if that's still the case. But the book before this was Tomboy, so I think I had this idea that I could keep looking at words that were outdated, but the ideas behind the words were continuing to just power through society, whether we use them or not. So it doesn't matter what you call this, the expectation of a woman's work is still there.
Yeah, and you talk about the fact that Trump spoke explicitly to American housewives in quite an archaic way, even though in many ways what the image he was appealing to, which is a mid-20th century archetype, it no longer exists or only exists in unexpectedly marginal ways.
Or in sort of subcultures now, which I think is part of this, the contention over the trad wife movement and the shame that women feel if that's what they aspire to, if they really just want to be wives and mothers. And so he was speaking to an outdated ideal and a norm that's no longer normal, but he was also conjuring this kind of nostalgia for a better America, even though that America wasn't better for everybody then. So I think he was drawing on that, but I don't know how common it is. It's hard to find good statistics, but I think the white middle class, housewife is suburban housewife is not that common anymore.
Although I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I think in America it is more common than in the UK for women to stay home when their children are preschoolers. So there's a big difference, right, between having a 2-year-old and having a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old. And I think that a pretty high proportion of American women are home during those years. I don't know why, whether it's because America is a richer country than the UK and so can more easily support women to be at home, or because of less childcare provision, or I don't know. But it is still, for those preschool years, it's still pretty common, I think, for women to be at home, although less common, of course, than in the past.
It's more common for American women to stay home than
Slightly, I
British
think
women.
so. Yeah, I
Oh,
think so.
that's so interesting. I would have thought the opposite because I would assume, but you can correct me, that there is some kind of parental leave policy.
Yes, but I think what's more common is for this may be why actually American women are more likely to stay home for a longer period. You're entitled to have, if you're employed, which most women are as opposed to self employed, you're entitled to have 12 months of maternity leave, which is it has very little pay, but it does mean you can go back to your old job at the end of the 12-month period, and the expectation generally is that you will. Um, I guess in America, because you don't have that right, you're more likely to just quit.
Well, I think if you work for a company with more than 50 people, you can take up to 6 months off unpaid.
Okay. Okay, okay.
Um, and I think one reason some women stay home in the early years is that childcare is so incredibly expensive here.
Yeah,
So
also true here.
you have to be able to make more than the cost of childcare, which was very difficult for me and very
Yeah,
confusing,
yeah.
especially because the magazine industry imploded when I was pregnant with my first child. And so I'd had plenty of work and it paid fine. And then not only did I not have much work, but it paid very little. But I certainly didn't intend to give up my career, except I was also enjoying myself immensely just hanging out with my baby. So it was very confusing. I think when there aren't those structures in place and each person is just trying to figure it out, there's no mass culture. Well, and maybe you have ideas about this, but there's no one moral path at all in America. There's no one common path. So each person is sort of sitting around trying to figure it out, which is kind of amazing because it's been many decades where, I mean, I guess there is a norm, which is working mothers, but it it's been for so long. It's odd to me that it hasn't gotten easier or just clearer about how to navigate it,
And everyone feels guilt.
and
That's
everyone feels bad. Yeah.
yeah. Yes. I mean, there is some data that I've seen suggesting that full-time working mothers are the most stressed and are most likely to take antidepressants and are like objectively worst off in terms of their mental health. Um, so it's not as though every path, it will obviously depend on circumstances, but it's not as though every path is like, has the same guarantee of um, misery. Um,
That's right.
and
Although,
mm,
think about, you know, the biggest consumer of Valium was, housewives and lobotomies.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes,
So
yeah. Oh goodness me, yeah. I wanted to ask about lobotomies because that's a very striking bit of your book.
like, why were those, in theory, those women would have had it sort of easier than any generation before them. Less labor, easier labor, right? I mean, but the expectations of what that, how well you're supposed to accomplish that labor, those go up. But it's interesting. So maybe full time working moms are taking antidepressants now more than other groups. Although women in general take twice as many antidepressants as men.
Possibly more, depending on the age group. Middle-aged women take a lot of antidepressants, particularly in
Oh
America.
well, just wait, man. Middle age is insane. It's crazy. It's such a bizarre, wild ride. I thought that child rearing was hard to navigate, but I can really understand medicating the heck out of yourself while everything you know about your body changes and the way you move through the world. But that's for another time.
That's for your next book, maybe. Yeah, it's one of the problems with the Friedan thesis, because you, of course, you talk about Betty Friedan and about that this whole era of Suburbia and Valium and Mad Men, and we'll be familiar with it from popular representation, but you do really dig into some of the details of what was going on. I didn't know, for instance, how much the American government supported the construction of suburbs, partly because of nuclear war. If you want to explain that just for a moment before we go back to Friedan.
Yeah, and I will say, before I became obsessed with, well, I was always very interested in all things to do with women's issues, but before I became like a sort of gender identity monomaniac, I was obsessed with urban planning, and
Oh,
I'm sure a
okay,
lot of
okay.
people in my life remember those days fondly when that's what I talked about. So I was always very interested in the relationship between the built environment and a sense of community. And I always found suburban landscapes extremely lonely, and I hated being in them. Um, Although once I had kids, I could sort of see the appeal, but um, I also hate driving, so they're not for me. But I was really interested in this relationship between the creation of suburbia and the kind of creation of the traditional nuclear family, which was, as lots of historians have pointed out, a real anomaly. Not that people weren't married and having children, but that generally there were extended family around, and you know we weren't so sequestered, and there was, between the military technology that got folded into these homes, and the subsidized mortgages, which were only for married couples and often only for white people, um, and the highway systems that replaced trolleys and trains. All of this was heavily subsidized by the federal government, and it created this normalcy. I guess that's the other thing that I'm perpetually interested in, is the the creation of normalcy and who gets to decide what it is. Who wins the battle to declare what's normal, which is so hard in this era of social media and a million different tiny little fractions of groups declaring victory in terms of social norms. But yeah, that I just found that fascinating. As much as I had studied urban planning, which I did once upon a time, I really didn't know how much the government paid to create this normalcy and way of life.
Partly because they wanted to be able to evacuate areas in the case of nuclear exchange, right? Isn't that? I had no idea that that would be part of the motivation for having more sparsely populated um, suburbs. But
Right, that in a evacuation routes in the event of nuclear war would be much easier in the spread out suburbs as opposed to the dense cities. And then many of them had bomb shelters. And one couple, I think it was the cover of Life magazine or Time. They had honeymooned in their bomb shelter, and if the Reds never came, they could be additional play spaces. So it was
wow.
all it was all folded into the Cold War and that Cold War mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I shouldn't laugh because it was a very real threat at the time, of course, but it just seems so um, distinctively 1950s and 1960s in retrospect. Um, so I have a slightly different view on. I'm less negative about suburbs,
Yeah.
possibly since having kids, but also because the British context is a bit different. You know,
Yeah, the Garden City kind of thing? Or
well, yeah, so we do have some of those post-war experiments in suburban planning. Not as much though, because we just don't have as much space. And one of the big differences between British and American homes, and indeed British and Australian homes, because my family are Australian, so I'm more familiar with the Australian suburbs, which are quite American in a lot of ways, is you guys have so much more living space. It's crazy. You have like 2 or 3 times the average floor plan, footprint as a British home. And it's always kind of interesting to me why exactly that is. The obvious answer is because you have a lot more land space, which is clearly true. But I was talking to my aunt about this recently, who lives in Australia and lives in the outer suburbs, where she's got a big block and a big house, and it's very kind of American. Um, Everyone has a double garage, you know, that kind of lifestyle. No one I know in Britain has a double garage. Um, she recalled, because she used to live in the UK, once going for a walk in the countryside in the absolute middle of nowhere and crossing a field and finding 3 terraced houses in the middle of a field. It's such a like peculiarly British thing to have built terraced houses. With there's no shortage of space. So anyway, it's an interesting puzzle as to why British houses are so small. But it does mean that actually I really get that I'd love to have a double garage. I'd love to have a rumpus room and a den and whatever stuff you guys you guys have access to.
I mean, this morning was all I live in the city in New York City, but we have a car. So this morning was alternate side parking. And I really wanted to get some work done and get some exercise. And my husband was sick. So I just paid $65 to not move my car. Like
Yeah.
I would that's how much the ticket is.
Yeah.
I rented work time. Although I often work in my car, which I actually don't. It's totally it's fine working in my car, but I would love to have a driveway, and I my ultimate dreams include a mud room and a garbage drawer, a pull-out
Oh.
garbage drawer. I
Oh,
have, yeah. I
nice.
mean,
Yeah.
I don't, and I don't, and I often think that I really like to blame a lot of external forces for whatever lacks in my parenting, and I I didn't have a ton of parenting myself, so I don't totally, I think I'm doing fine considering sort of where I came from, but sometimes I blame it on my apartment, which is a railroad apartment, and the kitchen is in the back, a little tiny kitchen in the back, and the eating and living area in the front. And so I never had that experience of I'm cooking dinner while my kids sit at the table and do their homework. Of course, New York City public schools, there's very little homework because the schools are so terrible and there are no expectations. But I had this kind of vision of who I was before, and I made lots of crafts, and for a while that was my professional job in the film and TV industry, sort of being a craftsperson, and um, lots of arts and crafts and lots of cooking and baking. And now I actually don't do any of those things, mostly out of fatigue and because I am a writer instead of doing those other things, but for a living anyway. But yeah, sometimes I think if I just had sort of more space or bigger space, or even, my daughter could have a drum set, if we had a garage there, like it's even hard for kids who play music in the city to find a place where to have band practice, or they have to make friends with rich kids who have actual brownstones.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is, I think what we're both concluding is that the suburban dream is not, that is really tempting for all of the atomization, etc. The idea of having, so in Australia, I don't know what it's called in America, but in Australia it's the quarter acre block. The quarter acre block's super aspirational. You have your detached house, you can't really hear your neighbors. We constantly hear our neighbors, because we're in terraced housing. And you can really see how people, particularly coming out of the war, would have so aspired to this. And yes, it did come with these social costs, but it came with massive advantages too. And to go back to Friedan, who I raised earlier, I reread The Feminine Mystique recently. And one of the things I really thought from reading it is that, yes, so often what she's describing is women suffering from loneliness, and it's loneliness that's causing their mental ill health. But it really occurred to me while reading it that this exact group of women that she's describing, so white, elite, typically university educated women, are exactly the same women who are now also famously suffering from mental ill health, right? They're not housewives now, but this is exactly the group of women who are seeing a lot of therapists, also getting therapists for their kids, who are taking a lot of antidepressants. Is it maybe the case that there's something else going on, that it wasn't actually to do with domestic role per se? This is the kind of the itching question I had when reading Friedan, and to some extent had while reading your book as well, thinking maybe there's some third factor.
I think the people at the lower echelons of the economic ladder are also really suffering, especially in America with this intense income inequality. And so I don't want to negate that, but I do think that we could argue a little bit that with suburbia, well, I want to say two things, but um, first, that with suburbia, came these other issues about that we're talking about being isolated, but also you don't really have work. Like, I'm not going to say that it made you happy to scrub your underwear on a washboard at the river, but I do think that feeling that there's a contribution and a real role for you, and that may have been very destabilizing of sort of what do I do now. I also think that, I quote a couple of times, I quoted this libertarian woman I met who is very young and beautiful and smart, and had a baby very young, and her mother had her young, and her grandmother had her mother young. And she talked about this genre of whiny white women books and media, which I immediately just thought, oh no, I wonder if that's what I've been writing. But it was very helpful because some of it I think is the expectation that life is supposed to be easy. And I think that expectation probably grew along with the middle class, because there was this, I always thought how extraordinary it was that with the growth of the middle class, so many people could have comfort, which was, scarce in times where you have, like, serfs and royalty. And I think there is and was this incredible promise of it, but I think that all of these expectations got piled on. And I think expectations get piled on women so that we can sell them things, so that they can, try to buy their way out of their shame or misery. But then I think we also put these expectations on ourselves. And one expectation is that it's not supposed to be hard. And there's really nothing about being alive on the planet that shouldn't be, you know, some kind of struggle. And I think when you're talking about people being miserable today, and this phenomenon, that Abigail Schreier was writing about, it's kind of the same thing. It's like we have decided that struggle is bad, instead of, going back to Buddha and life is suffering, and developing coping skills. So I wonder that's part of what happened. And it happens also while you have less of a community, and you're leaving people who are have a similar background and all kind of going out. I mean, I think it was Lewis Mumford who talked about all these different kind of ethnic groups go out to suburbia and they become white there. And like they don't really have anything, necessarily that much in common, but then they become part of this new demographic that they don't necessarily share that much with. So I, it's possible that that's part of what happened. I just wanted to say one other thing about suburbia, though. I think people have really developers um, in the past maybe 20, 30 years have really figured some stuff out. And there was this new urbanism movement, which was actually totally suburban, but so sort of like create houses, put them a little closer together, stick some porches on them, and have some community space. And they know how to kind of create these nouveau towns that replicate the community aspects of urban areas, but you still have your two-car garage. And I think I would like that. I kind of just I like to walk out my door and know people, and I like to see people walking around. So, and I like a lot of other families to know my kids. I guess that's one of my. You talk about marriage is good, and I talk about community is good. Community institutions and kind of allo parenting, and so I'm sure you can have that in the suburbs too. Around here, by the way, the suburbs, the taxes are 18 to $24,000 a year for a modest house. So I don't live in the suburbs because it's really expensive.
Which probably indicates that people want to live there, right? Yeah. On the mental health point, um, I want to be clear. I'm not saying, I don't think it's true, that white affluent women suffer more than other
Oh
groups.
yeah.
I don't think that's true. More that it's a group of people who are particularly sort of likely to seek out psychiatric help, both now and historically, which doesn't necessarily correlate with sort of objective um, distress, let alone objective material deprivation. Um, but I guess the insight, and it's a slightly painful kind of insight into human nature, is that certain types of affluence, getting your quarter acre block, getting your mudroom, we call that a utility room. I know exactly what you mean though, and I long for one, right? But getting this, it doesn't, it doesn't, it sounds so pat, it doesn't make you happy, right? And actually it has a tendency to generate particular kinds of ennui and anxiety, all of their own, particularly when getting those things necessitates also becoming more atomized. Because often what we're talking about, right, when we talk about um, the big move to the suburbs in the mid 20th century, is people moving to places where they don't know anyone. It's not like relocating city communities to suburbs. To some extent, that did happen in the UK. So, like, famously, East End working class moved out to places like Essex in the end of the 20th century, for multiple reasons. And to some extent, you kind of had those communities relocate just to bigger plots. And so, for instance, the Essex accent is the Cockney accent. It's the same London working class whites that have always lived there. And anyway, so sometimes you have relocation. But I think what happened more in America, correct me if I'm wrong, is people moving potentially quite long distances, and there being a kind of jumbling up of people's social connections. And that in itself seems to generate a lot of unhappiness, particularly for the housewife.
Yes, and I think you're very right about a number of things. One is Betty Friedan's elitism, and her, she's homing in on women who are having a similar experience to her. And I'm sure there were plenty of happy women. Um, so and who, don't have a giant best-selling book written about them. And I do think that there's a certain kind of affluenza, that, which by the way was an actual defense in a case in America where some kid, I think he hit someone with his car or something, and the argument was affluenza, and
Wow.
he won. So, there, sort of the more comforts you have, the more. Oh, I always talk about my friend who grew up in terrible circumstances, um, poor, and her father was so violent that um, he was forced to surrender parental rights, and her mother died when she was young. And um, I actually wrote about her in the book, but I was forced to cloak her because of some of the anyone who was impugning anyone else. I had to um, anonymize them, but she married someone wealthy, and we've talked about this a lot. She drives a very nice car that has a heated steering wheel, and she feels like she could never now go drive a car that doesn't have a heated steering wheel. And I mean, this is a person who grew up with nothing. So
Hmm.
the more comforts you get, sort of,
You get addicted to them.
nonetheless, I'm middle aged now, and I want all the comforts I possibly can have. I can live without a heated steering wheel, but I I do, yeah, I do think that the I think unhappiness sells. I mean, Betty Friedan's book was a huge bestseller, whereas, you know, We Moved to Suburbia and It's Great was not going to sell a lot of books. So she sold a story, and it was effective.
Which tells you something. It tells you that clearly she was tapping into something very true, and the fact that it has remained such a cultural touchstone tells you again that this clearly does resonate with people. And I can insist until I'm blue in the face that actually there are a lot of advantages to the suburbs, and whatever, but clearly there is a strong sense, maybe from elite tastemakers more than everyone else. I mean, that's something to get into, but there is a strong sense that there's something very depressing about the suburban housewife lifestyle that she was describing, and something low status. I mean, getting back to this whole euphemism treadmill question, um, just a housewife is a very persistent turn of phrase that clearly is uh, something slightly repellent about that, at least for, I guess, women who are most likely to be in public life and most likely to be talking about things and generating cultural depictions of these things. I wonder if maybe, yeah. So my sister, well, I put it to you. Here's my idea. I do wonder if, to some extent, the reason why the housewife has a bad name, and why we see why Friedan has remained such a prominent, her depiction of this life remains so influential, is maybe because the women who are least well disposed towards that lifestyle, who are least domestic, who are least interested in any of that, who consider it the most repellent, are the same women who end up editing magazines and newspapers, being on TV, having podcasts, writing books, etc. And maybe they give a slightly warped view, which is sincere for them, but is maybe not representative of what all women think. What do you think?
Yeah. And I think you're right. And I think that's a bit of a shift, because I write about some of the early women, like the Beechers, who they make a good living for themselves, sort of telling other women how to do domesticity correctly. But I don't know how much they were engaging in, or the editor, the woman who edited Ladies Goatee book, and she had 5 kids or something. And how much were they actually practicing any of this stuff themselves? I don't know. But it kind of goes from do as I say, not as I'm actually doing, from the women who are in the early publishing and magazine industries to um, these women who are, instead of promoting that, they're knocking it. And they're, although originally I think a lot of women's magazines were edited and run by men, and there's that great, there's the time that a bunch of feminists occupy the offices of the Ladies' Home Journal and insist that they report differently and more accurately about women's lives and not just from a male perspective. But I do think that you start having women writing from their own perspective instead of peddling some other idea of what womanhood should be, and they're working out their own shame. And I think what has persisted is that some women still feel, especially, educated women, feel shame about not working. And I think that's across race. Even I think it's a class issue, that even if you're the lucky and can afford to or choose to take time off, you feel so strange and you feel vulnerable, and you are, in America anyway, I mean, you can make yourself really financially vulnerable by doing that, no matter what you think is going on in your partnership. I just interviewed so many people who ended up penniless because they took time out from their careers. So I mean, some of that discomfort is coming from a practical place, and then I think there are women kind of in parts of the country that I've, not spent that much time in, um, who feel quite proud about staying home and feel like it's absolutely the right thing and the best thing for their children. And they still are, even though they're not internalizing the shame, they're still feeling some message, that just a housewife message. It's still being communicated from somewhere, you know? They feel they have to justify it.
Yeah, and to some extent, the online tradwife phenomenon is a reaction against that. Um,
That's what I think.
yeah, quite a forceful one sometimes. And some of it is, it does feel quite fetishy, as I think you note. Like there is definitely a genre of tradwife posting where the women are extremely busty and they're doing the kind of domestic work which doesn't really see. I mean, infamously, right, the woman who baked her own cinnamon crunch cereal or something like that because her boyfriend, husband, whatever, requested it. That seems not very. I mean, it's not unheard of for tradwife posting to have OnlyFans links underneath because actually it is a fetish. They're using it as like sexual advertising. Um, but that's only one part of it. There is also a whole phenomenon of kind of mummy blogging, as we used to call it, or women who are otherwise at home and not participating in public life do suddenly have, through the internet, a means of participating in public life in a way that you can do when your children are asleep or whatever. And to some extent, I mean, I don't I don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that all of that is just the caricatured end, because some of it I actually think is really good. And to some extent, we are hearing from women who we just weren't hearing from before because they didn't have the means to have a public voice. And these women are saying, I don't, I think the just a housewife characterization is unfair.
Yeah. I mean, that was my take. Obviously, there are these incredibly racist and actual bigoted people with platforms. Anyone can call themselves a tradwife and anyone can try to get eyeballs. But when I when I actually interviewed one woman with a decent following, I mean, she impressed me so much. And she was day trading while her daughter napped. She was far more on top of anything than probably I've ever been in my entire life. And I bet her home was clean and mine is not. Everything is a mess all the time. And it wasn't like that before I had kids, but but I feel, I actually feel like a lot of shame about that. And sometimes I say to my older daughter, who's an incredible slob, and I say, like, I can't imagine that any of your friends' houses look like this. Like, why, you know, and she's just like, I don't see it. I don't care about it. Doesn't bother me. And I am just driven absolutely mad by how messy it is, messy and dirty. No matter how much I clean. So I haven't been able to liberate myself from that either, from those expectations of what my life is supposed to look like, or at least my apartment.
Yeah, but is it bad to aspire to a clean home? I mean, I say this, there's laundry just out of shot. Okay, so just to be clear, I'm not preaching from on
We should
high.
fold it while we talk. We could
But
totally be doing that. I have laundry just over there that needs folding.
is it bad to aspire to these things? You know, this is the thing that I guess where I'm kind of a trad wife centrist. Okay, I like both in practice and in theory, in that I think that I the point you made about economic vulnerability is a very serious one, and it is hard, and it's a really really hard needle to thread, that one, because to some extent, unless you're going to have an enormous degree of state intervention in the family, which maybe I think maybe you are more tolerant of than I am, but you know that's one route, right? To have things like universal childcare and wages for housework slash UBI. You know, you can have one option to try and alleviate this problem is to have the state do it. Um, but if you don't go that road, there is just an inherent economic vulnerability that comes with bearing children, because there is a period where you can't work. It might not be very long, but it's a period, and it's often much longer for many women. And what do you do about that? You know, I mean, something I've noticed on TikTok, which is an interesting insight into um, I mean, obviously the algorithm is tailoring it, but what normie mums think about things, you know. Um, the number of women that I see on TikTok who talk about asking their boyfriends, they're not married to these men, the fathers of their children, asking them for money for trivial things. Like they'll joke about it, but like, you know, I ask my boyfriend for money so that I can go get coffee and cake on maternity leave, or I ask my boyfriend for money so that I can go have brunch with the girls. And I find that really unsettling. They think this is clearly normal and quite funny, like it's done for laughs. I find that quite unsettling because I think I, my husband and I have had completely joint finances since we were married, and to some extent before that. The idea of his money and my money is really alien to me. But then I guess if you're not married, I mean, this is sort of the problem, that if you pursue, if you step away from the old model, which is that we are one economic unit, and what's really traditional, right, is for the man um, to go out into the world and to bring money home, and then actually it's the woman who's in charge of bookkeeping, and she buys groceries and she's actually managing the money day to day. Like that's tradition. That's a traditional division of that labor. If you get rid of that and you have what apparently a lot of parents have, where they have separate bank accounts, and some people will even pay 50-50 bills and so on when they have children, like, yes, you are, I suppose, permitting women to have their own economic life that's separate from their husband, their boyfriends, and it does mean that if the relationship breaks down, there's no disentanglement process. But it also means surely that women are just always a bit poorer, because having children just means you will always, almost always, it will damage your economic abilities to some extent. And that just seems like a really, it does not seem obvious to me that the second modern option is better than the traditional one, not at all.
That's the thing. Have we just come to the conclusion that women are screwed no matter what?
I don't want to
That
come to that conclusion, but I do have a slightly tragic outlook on this question.
I know, I feel a bit stumped. You know, I am I am more comfortable with the idea of certain kinds of state intervention. Like, I mean, the thing about universal childcare is no one's telling you you have to partake of it. But I'm comfortable with, 1% of my imaginary paycheck, um, going into a fund that supports good child care, good quality child care. And and I'm supportive of the same way I love libraries, even though now libraries are, I mean, they're not for books, but they're sort of like adult daycare for homeless people. But oh, now I sound like a Republican. But I'm comfortable with a certain amount of democratic socialism, or I'm okay with pooling resources to help the neediest or to further the needs of society. But every there are so many people, there are so many different kinds of people, there's so much polarization. It's just it's and it's so easy to manipulate people to be for or against something in a deeply polarized society that I don't necessarily see us sitting down and saying, like, how do we create good citizens? I like the idea of the family being the project of the family, being about creating these like functional children who can go out into the world and, you know, make the world a better place. And I like the idea of everyone rising up a little bit together. And I like the idea of collectively working on the problem of poverty, even though I am addressing, I don't work on, on the problem of poverty, and I work on a lot of luxury belief issues, but they're important also in some ways. So I just think it's so hard to have that be the project in a pluralistic society. And when there used to be not that many people and there was a dominant culture, maybe it was a little easier to agree on. But there were always people who were incredibly disadvantaged and kept out of that project anyway. And just the way probably women are screwed to a certain extent, no matter what, some kind of class system is pretty much necessary. Maybe not in Bhutan. What happens in Bhutan? Everybody's totally fine all the time, right? But like there's no individualism of any kind. Who
Yeah.
cleans the toilets? I don't know.
I mean, it is probably the case that the best child rearing scenario is the hunter gatherer setup, which was how we raised children for 95% of our species history or whatever. So you're constantly surrounded by people you're related to and have known for your entire life. And there's only like 150 of you or something in the band. And everyone's always watching the kids and, the kind of commune thing, which of course there have been efforts in the modern world to recreate, normally not with much success. Um, yeah, partly because I think it really depends on people being related to each other. And normally communes are set up by people who are not related to each other, who are just held together by ideological links, which are actually quite fragile. So that's probably why it doesn't work very well. But unfortunately, all the models that we're sort of toying with, all the tragic models, are basically quite flawed. And it's kind of pick your poison, right? Like which one do you find, which trade-offs do you like better? That's the expression I like to use. Which trade-offs do you like better?
Well, I felt like I came out of this book research thinking, that any way you can replicate the clan, the early human clan, was good. And that there were, you can pay people, you can pay a nanny and a housekeeper if you have
But
money
that's
to
not
do that.
replicating the class. I mean, sorry to
You don't think
interrupt.
so?
Well, no, this is where I think maybe we disagree a little bit, having read your final section on policy recommendations. I'm really suspicious of the market and the state intervening in these systems. Probably more suspicious of the state doing it. I mean, I think that I'm also a realist, and I recognise that people need to, they need to pay the bills and you look after their children. Of course, paid childcare and state support is necessary in a lot of situations. But in terms of, I think the risk with something like universal childcare, right, which has been posited again and again by various feminist thinkers since the second wave, is that I think the state is very good, was quite good at providing the bare bones of what people need to survive. It can provide basic housing and food and basic care and protection from violence and things like that. It does these basic. The expression that I used in my first book was that the state is quite a good backup husband,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
Doing the things that men are traditionally supposed to do.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
but it also, in doing so, does have a tendency to fray the bonds that lie outside of the state and outside of the market. What civil society, let's say. The state does have a remarkable ability to undermine civil society by stepping in. It's not quite clear why that happens, like what exactly the mechanism is, but it does seem to be a very consistent mechanism that once the state starts doing something reliably for people, they stop doing it for each other for free. And then you're in this situation where you're forced to either rely on the state, which can be quite fickle, and also is providing basically very anonymous. You show up at your universal daycare center, and the people who care for your child, normally low paid women, will be basically regarded as fungible units within that system. The fact that their relationship or lack of relationship with your child is invisible to the bureaucracy. It's not invisible to the child, it's just invisible to the bureaucracy. It's not actually as good as, as family care, right? And then your only choice basically is either that kind of anonymous care or you pay for it yourself. But I just think that the things that we do for each other when we're not obliged to do them, well, we're not kind of economically obliged to do them, like the care that people will give to their children to children with whom they have a genetic relationship. I mean, that's why the hunter-gatherer band works better than the artificially produced commune. It's because genetic relationships mean something.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's my fear about that. We
Yeah,
introduce
yeah.
things with the best will in the world, but what they end up doing is actually making the family weaker, the extended family weaker.
Well, I understand that argument. And first I want to say, I was going to I'm talking about a variety of ways to replicate the clan. And so I think for me, I was very uncomfortable with the the babysitter situation for a variety of reasons. Just A, because I never knew how much work I was going to get. B, I was often, we have in where I live, we have sort of like Caribbean nannies, and then we have Tibetan nannies. There was just a whole sort of race issue that I was kind of like, I can't enter into this. I don't know how to navigate this, and we had some, but at any rate, there's paying people, whether it's daycare or nannies, etc. There's replicating the clan through, okay, like, the kibbutz or co-housing seems to be the most popular. You're not, the Danish model of co-housing, you're not related to those people, but there's an expectation of a certain amount of communalism, and I think you're more likely to get the old fashioned experience of kids can run around by themselves. And but again, I kind of started out being fascinated by the architecture of community. So, I haven't actually lived in co-housing, and maybe it would drive me totally nuts.
It
But
appeals to your urban design instincts, but
yes, it
right.
does. and then there's what you so there are policies, and then there are changes at the policy level, the state level, the community level. We could really strengthen community institutions, like I I'm not I can't even think of a single community institution I'm connected to besides the school. And then there's the personal. And so I found I'm not a joiner. I was like a stoner druggie in high school, and I mean I hung out with people, but um I was always, yeah, I wasn't a group person. I wasn't on, like, my brother was on, like, the in the French club and the outing club, and I just was not. I wasn't a club person, but I did join a mom's group, and it was kind of great. And we helped each other out a lot. And even in my downstairs neighbor, who's leaving for a year, so I'm really sad. But my kids pick up her kids sometimes at school if she's running late, or her kids just wander up here. They're much younger than my kids, and it fills me with joy. Like, it's exactly what I wanted. And when I was growing up, before my parents got divorced, we had a real community. And it was a community of hippies, who a lot of whom played music. And so yes, I mean, I think the adults were wasted all the time. And we were running around unsupervised in a kind of, I mean, it was very romantic, because the town I'm originally from was once a beautiful kind of tourist resort and was completely run down. Yeah, we were running around unsupervised, and it was super fun. And I think I've been searching for that experience my whole life, and have found it in little dribs and drabs here and there with different kind of groups of friends. And I loved meeting, as odd as it is, like how segregated we are in New York, especially by class, but also by race. Like, I still enjoyed most of the people I met through parenting. And so I did feel like I replicated the clan in a bunch of different ways. And it was a real patchwork, and it was very confusing. And I think what I wanted to communicate to people was that it's completely fine if it's confusing, and if it's a patchwork, and if it doesn't look like Instagram, and if your apartment is messy, and to normalize the struggle in the same way that we need to, talking about, kids need to feel all these emotions that we've labeled bad, right? Like, because they're not learning to be resilient. And all I could have just been like, this is great. I'm living better than 85% of the entire world, maybe 90, I don't know. And I live in a slightly falling down, like, fourth floor walk up, but it's great. And I think post pandemic, it's been, I'm knocking on my wooden desk, but my kids seem to be doing fine right now. I don't want to take it for granted. And so many kids are not. And I just start, like, fine is great. Fine is the new great. That's really my attitude now. And I think it's hard for women to get there, because they keep thinking they're doing everything wrong.
Because of the
And
super mom ideal, as you
this is
describe
the
it.
Superman.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it can be, there's that Japanese idea of wabi sabi and the beauty of imperfection,
Hmm.
and the kind of, when they take a broken piece of pottery, and they fill it with a beautiful gold. And you could look at your whatever version of the clan that you're able to construct for yourself, and look at it like those beautiful, beautiful broken and repaired bowls.
Can I give one example of civil society supporting mothers, which I think is very cool and is quite rare? I assume you probably have this in the States as well, but in the UK, we have a lot of playgroups. So I take my son regularly to a couple of playgroups, and they're held in a church hall. So the church let us use it for free or for a small fee to cover heating costs, because it's the middle of the week, so they're not using it for services. And they're run typically by middle-aged and older women whose children are older, and they will make tea and kind of do the admin, which is quite straightforward. And they just advertise it, and you show up, and there are toys which the kids share, and everyone helps tidy up at the end. And the state is completely uninvolved, and the market is completely uninvolved, except to the extent that you will pay a small fee just to cover some costs, but they'll waive it if you're low income, and it's a very cheap thing to do. And I think it's so great. But one of the things about playgroups is they are dependent on women not working, at least to some extent, including these middle-aged women whose children are older. And I don't know this, and it may be, I don't know if there's any research on this, but my guess would be that playgroups are probably more common in areas where you do have a lot of women, middle-aged women who are affluent enough not to have to work. And so they have the spare, or not have to work full time. And so they have the spare time to be putting towards these kind of activities, which are not profit making, which no one is obliged to do, no one is economically or legally obliged to do. And yet are so precious and do make such an enormous impact. I so much prefer going to a playgroup than being, the lonely mum at the playground, right? And it is this, and this is the, bringing us back to this difficult question about women's involvement in the labour market. If all women are working full time, there are no playgroups. It's like it does mean that you end up with that civil society stuff collapsing. And there are other advantages. It does mean that women have more economic independence, can leave a bad husband more easily. But it does, like the cost is quite significant, and it's not just plague. There are all sorts of other things that women have, that empty nester women or women whose children are all at school. There are ways in which those women have contributed to their communities, which they could not otherwise do if they were working full time. And I think that one of the reasons why we're seeing sort of high trust societies degrade, there are lots of reasons for it, but I think one of the reasons we're seeing that is because we don't have those women. There's this kind of bulwark of like middle class, middle-aged women who've held up so much community infrastructure over the decades. And when those women aren't there because they're still working, we lose those things, and it's kind of a quiet loss, but it's a real one. And yeah, I feel like that's not mentioned often enough in relation to this working mother's quandary.
Well, it's interesting because um, I have I have a lot of thoughts about that. But I was just thinking that years ago I wrote this article about another woman with my same name and birthday, and we'd for almost 20 years our records were crossed in the city of New York, and we ended up being friends, and she's a grandmother now. And I have young children because I had children so late. So like in theory, you know and she's actually raising this kid because it's a long, very sad story of her son impregnating this very young woman anyway. But so she would be able to do that, and I wouldn't because I had my children so late. And I was also thinking about how in America, land of strange urban planning, we also invented those 55 plus communities where like at that age women might be, I don't know how I don't know how common those are or popular anymore, but sequestering themselves out there. But it reminded me that Eleanor Roosevelt, one of her suggestions was that mothers of grown children could help young mothers. This is one of her suggestions during the Depression, and that could be sort of formalized, or I mean, from the state, but a small stipend for being, again, like replicating that allo parent on some level. And um but I do think here we also have this kind of play group model, at least in around where I live. And or sometimes people would put a little bit of money in and even like pay someone to come and facilitate a little bit, or um but I don't know that you, I guess I'm just curious that no one sends their nanny with the kid.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, so sometimes nannies go. Yeah.
yeah,
There's not really the intention behind them, and actually
yeah,
there is some, I won't go into it in detail, but there is some, like, local politics where some playgroups don't want nannies. They would rather have the
yeah,
mums come, and they'll prioritise mums, and anyway, causes
yes,
problems. Um, but,
I'm sure it
yeah.
does.
Yeah, it is a mix, but they're not run by nannies. They're
Right,
run
they're
they're run by
not.
older women who have older children.
Yeah, yeah. I think, and again, you're in this like third space, so the that would be one little advantage, I guess, of having a smaller home, is that you partake of these third spaces, these community
You're kind of
spaces.
forced to leave your tiny little
Yeah,
home, yes.
because here it would be, I don't think there was anyone in my group who had like a really nice big apartment for whatever reason. Um, Now my kids seem to know some people like who've gotten their hands on some very nice real estate, but so nobody had a good apartment to really um, spend time inside. But I guess I mean, but the churches are also, are your churches like our churches don't have to pay taxes, so they are subsidized to some extent by.
I don't know the details, but yeah, I
My
think it's
objection, I
quite cheap
just,
to run.
here we can't park in front of the churches, so I care less about them not paying taxes than I do about the fact that they take up parking spots. But I mean, yes, these are replicating the clan solutions that are nice. And why do we fight so vehemently about women's work and parenting? Why does it, why do we each other about it and scream at each other about it?
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.